I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds, welcome to my horror house and happy 100th birthday to F W Murnau's Nosferatu. I wasn't intending to make a video about it, but I was going to watch it to mark the centenary, and I saw it yesterday and it knocked me sideways, I'll be honest with you. So there are a few things I would like to sort of chat about. I saw it years ago and it really affected me. I mean, I was a kid when I saw it. It was one of my formative horror movie watching experiences, and Count Orlocks scared the pants off me, and I think that's maybe why I've avoided watching it since, because it's a precious formative horror memory, and I didn't want to return to the film and be disappointed and in some way maybe lessen the impact of that memory. So happy days when I watch the film again and find out that it still has the power to chill, to scare, and to repulse. Count Orlok and Max Schreck's performance, it's an all-timer, isn't it? It's an all-time great performance. I mean, just absolutely terrifying. By now everyone surely knows that Nosferatu is an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, which almost didn't survive the litigation that followed. Luckily, copies of the film did survive, and the shadow that the movie casts and the roots that it's set down in horror cinema are absolutely undeniable to this day. The familiar story then, very quickly, is that we have a young sort of go-getting businessman called Hutter, who leaves his wife in the German town of Visburg to travel to Transylvania to secure a property deal with a Transylvanian count who is a vampire, isn't he? Even before he heads off, though, we are clued into the fact that something is deeply wrong here. For a start, his boss, who sends him on the errand, a character called Knock, who is our Renfield stand-in, is corresponding with Orlok. For a start, he's mad as a box of spanners, and he's corresponding with Orlok, but in these sort of indecipherable sort of occult hieroglyph letters. Think if the Zodiac Killer was even more mad, he would be sending coded messages like this, and seeing those letters and not reading them, and then later on the Count himself poring over the written response in these strange sort of hieroglyphs, really puts you on edge and makes you think something weird's going on here, and something that's so outside my realm of understanding that it just looks like absolute terrifying gibberish. Hutter travels to Transylvania in the section of Bram Stoker's novel, which is the strongest section of the novel, and usually the strongest section of any adaptation of the novel. I don't think Stephen Stoker himself hit the heights that he achieved in the Dracula's Castle section of Dracula. To my mind, it's probably the strongest period of sustained horror writing in certain Western literature that I'm aware of. The Dracula's Castle section is just so archetypically brilliant. You would have to work so hard to muck up adapting it for the screen. It's absolutely all there for you, and if you have a hard time adapting it from the prose, then Murnau absolutely lays out a blueprint for how to do it. This journey to the east, where you're moving from the very safe straight lines and right angle corners of your world of home, wife, job, work, where you move out into the, you find out that the borders of the world, there are no straight edges there. They're all very fragile and permeable, and strange things seep in at the edges, and what you thought was your fixed reality sort of slips out through that same sort of porous border. One of the remarkable things that Murnau does is take Hutter from this wide, sort of bright, open daylight garden world, and slowly, as his journey continues, he boxes him in. At first he's out in wide nature, but then he becomes sort of boxed in by the architecture of the buildings around him, the doorways, arches that start to slash off whole sections of the frame, and you see him getting smaller and smaller, more compressed under the weight of these strange new angles that are pressing in around him. One of the many images that will be brought to bear to invoke the idea of a fly in a spider's web, or a spider in a web. Much later on, you will see Orlok himself on the deck of the ship with the rigging behind him, looking very much like a spider's web. With him now, his hands are spiders. I mean, let's be honest, looking very much like the spider controlling the center of the web. So many tropes introduced here that will, now that 100 years have passed, become comedy rather than horror. But certainly when he mentions Orlok's name in the inn and everyone suddenly goes silent and turns to look at him, makes you instantly think of the slaughtered lamb in American Werewolf in London, which even back then was being played for laughs. And now I don't think you can do that scene unless your intention is to play it for laughs. But certainly when you see Hutter looking at the Book of Transylvanian Superstitions and literally throwing it on the floor and laughing at it, you know he's in trouble. Talking of things moving from the spectrum of horror through to comedy to a modern eye, I guess some of the special effects might look more comedic now than horrifying, but certainly I imagine to a contemporary audience's eye would have been very strange and effective, and affecting so many tricks that Murnau tries to employ to get across this eerie and this uncanny. I mean, slow cranking the camera to make Orlok's carriage seem like it's moving unnaturally fast, fading images in and out so that Orlok himself seems to be able to pass through doors. I guess using the stop motion technique of locking off the camera and then moving things incrementally to make things look like they're moving on their own. There's a fantastic shot when the carriage is taking Hutter through the Transylvanian forests, where the image is just inverse, so the blacks are whites and the whites are blacks, just showing you that you sort of passed the Rubicon here now. Up is down, left is right, white is black. You're through the looking glass, to use another sort of cliche. Max Schreck himself is utterly terrifying, made up to look like an absolute grotesque. He's turns cadaverous, at other times spider-like, at other times insectile. There are times when he moves as if he's still riddled with rigor mortis, and other times he sort of creeps with sort of the slow patience of something like a praying mantis. And I don't think it's a mistake that sort of images from nature sort of spring to mind when you talk about his look and his performance, because I think one of the interesting things that Murnau does here is really sets all within the spectrum of nature. Nature plays very, very heavily in Nosferatu. It's not the expressionism of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which all sets which added to the unreality of things with crazy angles and weird distorted buildings and distorted perspectives. The expressionism of Nosferatu here comes through the natural world and some really impressive nature photography. Hutter moves through this nature, leaving his safe world, his world of boxes, and the world of the city and the west, and moves out into this vast space of fields and misty mountains, waterfalls, fast-running rivers that he needs to cross on rickety bridges to get to the other side, to get to the next stage of his journey. And in this nature, there is, first and foremost, this bizarre sight of a hyena used as a werewolf, which spooks all the horses in the local area. That must have looked so bizarre to contemporary eyes. Doesn't even bother to explain whether is this Orlok in werewolf form, or are there also just werewolves out here as well. Later on, a professor gives a lecture, and We see images of a Venus flytrap closing around a fly. We see a fly caught in a spider's web and being wrapped up by the spider, and we see a sort of a shot through a microscope. All these tricks and effects brought in of a polyp trapping its prey with its tendrils. The card for that section reads, I should note that in those days Professor Buller was teaching his students about the dreadful methods of carnivorous plants. One viewed with horror the mysterious workings of nature. And one of the things I find most fascinating about Nosferatu is that Orlok is not placed outside nature. He's not presented necessarily as supernatural. The natural world is presented as large, diverse and scary enough that it can contain within it something like a vampire, like Orlok. And Orlok is aligned very closely and very specifically with real world nature, specifically infection, plague, and I guess as we would refer to it now, pandemic. The film itself was made hot on the tails of what's erroneously called the Spanish flu, but the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920. That and the huge death toll of World War One would have been playing absolutely as current events on the minds of contemporary people watching it. But Orlok himself is not outside nature. He's not supernatural. He is of nature. He literally is a plague bringer. And by some perverse coincidence, it is quite shocking to 100 years later watch a sequence where through government mandate people are told to stay in their homes and quarantines are set in place, and isolation if you're infected to self-isolate. Like I say, pure coincidence, but absolutely on the nose to show how even 100-year-old art, 1,000-year-old art can still, if there's enough there, it will keep having new things to say to contemporary audiences. And beyond that, there are sections in this film which are just pure cinema. You can see its effects in cinema today. Francis Coppola, I think, was very wise to very clearly reference many aspects of Nosferatu, especially the first act in his Dracula's Castle section of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Quite perversely, when the plague comes to Visburg and the mob there decides to blame an outsider, blame Nock, the person in the asylum who's escaped. He's responsible for the plague, and they chase him around the town. I didn't expect to think about Halloween Kills when I watched Nosferatu, but lo and behold, the scene in last year's Halloween Kills where the mob wrongly identifies this escaped asylum patient, this bald, squat, little breathless man, and chase him around chanting "Evil dies tonight," is almost exactly the scene from Nosferatu, if you can believe that. And the whole thing ends with a section that is almost, well, it's pure cinema, with Orlok's shadow ascending the stairs, opening the door to Ellen's room, and then entering, and Ellen sort of trying to represent the power of the person without sin, whose innocence can trap this evil, and makes him stay until dawn and the cock of the crow. And even that is going back to something biblical, with the cock shall crow 3 times. But that whole section, even if you haven't seen the movie, you will have seen images from that section of the movie. It's working on such a fundamental level of archetype that I think that succession of images will probably last hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. If you've never seen Nosferatu, you have seen Count Orlok. You know what he's like. He's still in the culture. I mean, he's absolutely still present in the culture. Orlok's image is everywhere. It's been lampooned. It's been taken. It's been satirized. It's been used for comedy. Christ, it's been used in things like SpongeBob SquarePants. Count Orlok at 100 is absolutely still a vital part of the horror conversation and the horror landscape. Astonishing, absolutely astonishing. Equally astonishing that the work still has the power to shock and surprise. There was a moment in the film when Hutter is being attacked for the second time, probably the scariest section in the movie, where Orlok just slowly walks down the corridor and approaches him, and there's nothing he can do. He just takes his time, funereal, like, as I mentioned earlier, that the slow stealth of the praying mantis. And we suddenly cut back to Visborg, and Ellen wakes from a sort of premonition nightmare that her husband is in trouble, and she sits bolt upright and stretches her hands out to the left-hand side of the frame, reaching for her husband, who she can see in her mind's eye. And we cut to Orlok, who has fed and turns and looks over his shoulder to the right-hand side of his frame, as if he has heard her and sees her off the edge of his frame, breaks that wall, and suddenly time and space has smashed together, and they're interacting with each other over a distance of hundreds and hundreds of miles. Remarkable, absolutely remarkable. It's an absolutely stunning piece of work that still holds the power to surprise, repulse, chill, shock, and engage. Happy birthday, Nosferatu. Wow. Transylvania to secure a property deal with a Transylvanian count who is a vampire, isn't he?